I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth of the Royal Academy of Engineering's Innovation in a Crisis series webinars. I'm Elspeth Finch, I'm the founder and CEO of IAND, and I'll be the chair for this afternoon's session. This Innovation in a Crisis series is a single part of the Academy's response to COVID-19. The Academy has rapidly started various initiatives to leverage its expertise and its networks, both nationally and internationally, to help solve critical challenges and assist the public health response. The role of engineering in response to COVID is important, and we really hope this series will highlight many different ways it's contributed. The series covers a broad range of topics, and the discussion around what panellists have learned will help feed into the Academy's broader policy work. This is the fourth in the series, and we're delighted to have panellists willing to talk about their experiences, and obviously, of course, having delegates willing to attend and ask questions. We'll begin with a brief introduction from the panellists, with a few questions that I'll be posing to them, whilst we'll then be starting to hopefully capture some questions from each of you. You'll have the opportunity to submit your questions. In order to post these, just simply click on the Q&A feature, which should be located towards the bottom of your screen, and type your questions in the open field. There's also a feature that allows you to upvote questions posed by other delegates. So if there's a question that's very similar to the one that you're wanting to ask, if you can just upvote that, it'll just make it much easier to collate good questions for the panellists. We'll try and cover as many questions as possible, time permitting. As hopefully you're all aware, today's session is about delivering the Nightingale Hospitals, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to today's speakers. They're James Hepburn, who's Principal Building Services Engineering at BDP, Rebecca Stubbs, Technical Advisor at Mott MacDonald, and Richard Cantlay, Global Head of Healthcare Facilities at Mott MacDonald. So first of all, I'd like to introduce James, and please can you take a couple of minutes to introduce both your role at BDP and also your involvement in the Nightingale Hospitals, really kind of setting the scene and how these got started and your work particularly at Excel.
Certainly, yes. So I'm James Hepburn. I'm a Principal and Building Service Engineer at BDP. Generally at BDP, I would say I focus more on sustainable and low energy buildings, but I do cover probably most of the sectors and have worked on hospital healthcare projects before. And my role for the Nightingale Hospital in London, I guess I led the BDP team, who were engineers, designers and architects, working from on-site and from the office to help deliver the scheme. My initial involvement with the Nightingale Hospitals was through a discussion just at the start of, or before lockdown. I had a discussion with a good friend of mine, Matthew Shaw, who is the Chief Executive of Great Ormond Street. I was talking to him one evening on FaceTime, and he was leading the ICU response for North London, looking at what the bed requirements would be. He was looking at all the information that's coming out of Spain and Italy, and seeing what he could see was a large, significant shortfall in ICU facilities. So he was, at the time, they were looking at how they could increase the capacity there. I had a good discussion with him about it, and I said he was looking at doing something in a warehouse at the time. I said I'd take it away and we'd look at producing a paper on it. So the next day I got a team of healthcare specialists from BDP, engineers and architects. We had a sort of good session and pulled a paper together, which was really looking at what the issues were, looking at what the key points were, and really looking at the most appropriate buildings type for it. And rather than warehouses and sports halls, which was the initial thinking, we suggested using convention centres and exhibition centres. We were looking at the time for North London, they thought they needed 400 or 500 beds. We were looking at the Business Design Centre as a potential. And we very quickly pulled together using Revit a sort of scheme of a Nightingale ward, looking at the size of the area that would be required for that. I sent that off to Matt late that night on the Tuesday, had another catch up with him on the Thursday, and it seemed that it wasn't going to be something that was just North London, it was going to be for the whole of London, and it wasn't 400 or 500 beds, it was more like 4,000 or 5,000 beds. At which point I said that the only thing that was big enough really was the Excel Centre. It's got it's a relatively modern exhibition space, and it's got a decent sized floor plate. And when you looked at the sort of space take required per bed, that was the only thing that was large enough in London. I again sent that off to Matt about midnight on the Thursday, and I think the Army then were there at the weekend doing a recce of the space, and they made recommendation and they said it was achievable, what was being proposed was achievable. And then I turned up on the Monday morning with a team of engineers and architects to work with other engineers to start to sort of deliver what we ended up delivering.
I mean, that is absolutely incredible pace, which is not something that, as a construction sector, we're always sort of renowned for. So what do you think were the elements that contributed to it being able to move forward so incredibly quickly?
Well, I guess the sort of, someone needed to make a decision. So I think the Army made a very clear recommendation that it was possible. And it's hard to see it now because we've sort of, so much has moved on, and we sort of feel like we're over the worst of it. But that was right in the middle of the sort of crisis when the number of deaths were increasing every day, and there was sort of, it was just before we arrived on the Monday we started was the day lockdown started. But in terms of actually the delivery on site, and I think it was really, we had a very clear brief from day one, and we had a clear way of making decisions. So we had people who were able to make decisions that would allow the whole team to move forward quickly.
And I think one of the things which is quite interesting when you're talking about when you're looking at different sites and recommending them is how quickly you are able to do different option appraisal. Using both your experts within BDP, but also tech like Revit. Can you say a bit more about how quickly you're able to do that process?
So it's relatively easy. We've got healthcare specialists that can sort of very, very quickly, using the sort of their experience and the tools within Revit to sort of scale up what sort of plan it would be. And that was the thing. The numbers are quite significant on this. So it was really trying to get an idea of the size of the space that required. And then it was really as basic as looking on the internet and seeing a lot of these exhibition spaces. They're spaces for rental, for organising events. So they have, in effect, brochures online that you can sort of access and download, and you can look at the different spaces. And it was really just trying to identify large spaces that were big enough to cope with the space requirement that we needed from a bed perspective. Also, the logistics around the site is quite significant. And the other advantage that the Excel offered is because it's relatively modern, it had a sort of a series of below ground ducts and servicing infrastructure that we felt at the time could be used, and we did end up using a lot of that, and that was a real advantage. I think that's possibly, although all the exhibition centres that have something like that, the Excel Centre, because it's about 20 years old, has probably slightly older than that, but it has a sort of a more modern engineering infrastructure to support the sort of hospital facility that we were trying to create.
Okay, and so before we move on to Rebecca, because you were involved not only in the kind of the setting it up and defining what the requirements were, but also you were then on site in Excel. Can you talk a bit more about what your role was in Excel before we move on to Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I was there for literally a week, and then I became ill. I've had my serology test through today as well, so I have got, I am immune now, hopefully, if that's what it means. So I've got antibodies. But it was an incredible time. We had a sort of a growing number of people involved with the project all the way through. It started with probably 20 or 30 on the first day, and it seemed to increase sort of exponentially almost each time as the contracting teams came on. So it was incredibly it was exhilarating and it was exhausting, because you're trying to get your head around what you needed to do and plan ahead. And on that first morning, we had to, in effect, by lunchtime, have a plan in place to deliver the first 500 beds. We were challenged to deliver the design for 500 beds by the lunchtime, but because we had to be delivering the 500 beds by the end of the week, that was the initial target. So it was being very, very focused, making decisions that you felt you could cope with, that were flexible enough to accommodate change, that you were confident were sort of could deliver the brief, and the brief was potentially going to change. So it was quite a fun thing to do, but it was a huge collaborative effort, lots of communication. Initially, it was just trying to work out what everyone was doing and who everyone was, because there was a team of people that were sort of brought together who hadn't necessarily worked together before.
That's hugely helpful. And I think if it's possible, I'm now going to move on to Rebecca, because it'd be great for you to say a bit more about your role both at Mott MacDonald, but also your involvement as a runner and your role within Excel.
Thank you very much. So I'm Rebecca Stubbs and I'm a technical advisor, as has already been said, for Mott MacDonald, but I have a background particularly in structures and civils, but more recently have moved into multidisciplinary technical advisory within healthcare in the last 6 months. So I was brought onto this project, and as we have kind of colloquially named it, ended up taking a role of a runner on site, which Mott's took a very I think a really good decision to try and minimise the amount of people on site. So it meant that we operated a system where we basically had a very small amount of people as a kind of interface really on site, and we had a much bigger team, I'd say, almost back of house, that were based in their home offices at the time, which we called upon. But we were, as a kind of these runners, or as the kind of central point, we were very much almost a postbox type system where people would come to us with problems or with queries or often with challenges or a demand for, I've got this problem, or I need to resolve this in terms of operation for when this hospital goes live. How do I achieve this? That was often the kind of starting statement. And we had to then very quickly go, okay, can we just say yes or no to this? Or is this something that needs more technical input? Or, you know, I actually need to give to someone else because this isn't necessarily within our remit. I have to say, I'll use the word we probably a lot, and actually I don't necessarily mean that as in a we in a Mott sense. As James has already said, this was a very organic team that was cross-discipline, and the kind of lines between which organisation was what was often not, it didn't matter because we were ultimately one team. So yeah, just a note, when I say we, I don't necessarily mean exclusively Mott's. Yeah, so we did do quite a lot of running about, but there was a lot of generally communication. That was our role, and stakeholder liaison in lots of ways, both on a clinical side, but also more external stakeholders. So Mott took a role that was more around the externals of the building and doing a coordination piece, I would say, particularly around logistics and operations and some of these other services such as waste and the ambulance services and the fire brigade, and security actually critically as well, that say BDP were less involved in because they were doing kind of more of the internals of the building. I think that's probably all. I'll leave it there.
But I think for me that's really interesting, because I think what you're talking about is two things, which is one, the kind of complexity of all of the interfaces which need to be managed at the same time. You're having to, so there's three challenges which I was hearing from you, which is one, the complexity of having so many different interfaces. You've got the external environment with liaising with the police and the ambulance service, you know, and all of the stakeholders on the external side of the building. And then you've got the same challenges internally in terms of all the stakeholders involved in making sure that the clinical setting was right. So for me, there's two things which are really interesting. One, sort of how you deal with all those critical stakeholders, and two, how you do that in an environment where you're having to move so incredibly quickly, where you're having to collaborate with people you have never met before, and deliver an outcome within a week. So could you talk a bit more about those two challenges?
So the first challenge about communications, there was a couple of things that happened on site, which I believe was run across some of the other Nightingales, and hopefully Richard can clarify this in a moment or two, was kind of trickled down from the military type style. That was, we had daily briefings at 8 AM and 5 PM that included all of the clinical teams, all of the disciplines, the army, etc. And there was a kind of one, sometimes two representatives from each organisation or each discipline that sat in those meetings and basically talked about blockers and current challenges and barriers to progress, and talked critically about critical path items or things that had happened during the day which were new or needed to be resolved within that next period of time. That was really critical to keep pace and to try and understand where things weren't going to plan, or to get everyone on board. And it took a couple of days for the kind of mentality of those meetings to fall into place, and for people to kind of be very succinct around what was happening, and to not just talk as a summary of what's happened during the day, but actually critically what's not going to plan and what do you need help on, was really the two key bits of information. We then did that in Mott's sense. We then had meetings within our back of house technical teams that then followed typically at 9 or 8:30 to then feed back what happened at the 8 o'clock briefing. And we often then had 5:30 calls as well, to kind of do a bit of a debriefing and to inform that kind of wider group who weren't present within the briefings on site. So that was something that was really important. And people just called and came and spoke to you. You know, I've got enough phone numbers from Nightingale to organise a riot because everyone, you know, you just called someone, picked up the phone and said, you know, where are you on site? I've got this. And you built rapport with people rapidly, based on really frequent conversation. Drawings was also really important. So quite often getting people around something, you know, we didn't really have the luxury of big printers. We had ups and downs with the printing. So sometimes you were dealing with out-of-date drawings, but it was really important as a communication piece to use drawings. That was something that was really important. In terms of your second question, I'm trying to remember that was, I might have wrapped both up actually.
I think you really clarified. So for me, there's something which is around the ability to, because you've got so many different interfaces between stakeholders, and you're having to move so quickly. So what I was hearing from you is that there's two things that worked really effectively. One, which is around the clarity of the brief and everybody having the same view around what the brief is and what the requirements are and what you're trying to achieve. And I think the second one is the effective communication and a cascade of information on a daily basis to make sure that there were no blockers around it. I think the third piece, which I'd like for you to just talk a bit more about, is the blockers, because that's not a word that we tend to use in traditional engineering projects. It gets used a lot in the world of tech, and I think in the army, but doesn't normally get used in engineering. Can you talk a bit more about how you defined what the blockers were and how you worked with other people to solve them?
Lots of blockers were quite often around pieces of information. So, and that was kind of where our role came into, because quite often a blocker came the other way around, where it was someone in the design team saying, you know, I don't have this bit of information, I need this to then be able, you know, I've got an assumption here that I need you to clarify. It was quite often an example of a blocker before you could really get sign off on something. And we use drawings quite literally for sign off and ask, you know, stakeholders to review a drawing and sign off, have, you know, accompanied with some kind of walkover or some kind of conversation around the information you were presenting to them. So that is an example of a blocker. Another blocker was probably a resource question around pace, or if you hadn't had sign off, you weren't able to get hold of someone, or, you know, they weren't quite happy with it, so you needed to change something. So that was a blocker in that sense. Or if something was physically not doable, which didn't happen very often. Often we, you know, could find solutions to stuff. But so for example, I did a lot of work with the ambulance station, and we just didn't have good water connections. We didn't have foul. There was some really significant infrastructure problems there that meant that we had to then go to a different solution. So those are examples of blockers.
So really, are you saying the blockers were around helping you have that really brutal prioritization about the things that were critical to make sure that this would be effective? And that you could
effective and delivered under the timescales, because that was the other really, really critical bit that, you know, often it was that we had this real I can't remember exactly what day it was. We had a milestone of, it was like midnight on the Thursday, I think. I can't quite remember. It moved slightly because of a couple of things. And, you know, everyone was just going for that. You know, there was no, as well as the brief being super clear, the time scale of, right, we've got to hit this at this date. Therefore, there is no slip. We have to get, you know, we have to get sign off by the fire brigade today. They can't come back on site tomorrow. We've got to implement, you know, the fencing guys are here tomorrow. Therefore, we need to get all these changes approved tonight, because they won't have time to do another round of changes. So that was the other restriction, was in terms of time. Massively.
So when you've got restrictions around time, you've got restrictions around the quality that needs to be done. So what things did you have to compromise on to hit those deadlines?
Sleep. And I think there was a bit of lessons learned, I think, from the London project was about well-being, and I probably, again, this might come back later on in the conversation, was that we, I know, for example, in Cardiff, they ended up doing kind of shifts where they had an overlap in terms of staffing, whereas us within, particularly as some of the runners and the kind of main interfaces, you know, we just busted our asses, quite frankly, and worked really, you know, we were up on site for 7:30 every day prior to the 8 o'clock briefing, and often we're still trying to mark up drawings or send around comments at 11 p.m. at night. And it only really worked because all of us were within, you know, we were either staying in hotels or we lived very, very close to sites. So actually sleep, we were still managing to get most of the time 6 hours at least, but, you know, it worked because it was a very, very accelerated program. You know, you can do that for 10 days. But if we'd had to do that for a month, I think we all would have killed over. And yeah, I think there were some lessons learned quite quickly, and they were implemented on some of the other sites, which was good.
Perfect. So I think it'd be really interesting, Richard, to hear from you, because obviously you've had a wider role within the Nightingale Hospitals, and it'd be great to hear about your role sort of broadly, about your learnings from Excel onto other sites, as well as your role more broadly.
Okay, thank you for that. So good afternoon. So I'm Richard Cantlay. I am Mott MacDonald's Global Head of Healthcare Facilities. So I've worked in healthcare for the past 20 years, typically leading teams supporting the NHS to deliver large acute hospitals through the business case process, procurement, and into construction. So on the Nightingale projects, I really led Mott MacDonald's response to all 4 of the projects we were involved in, which was London, the Cardiff one, that Principality, the Glasgow one, and the Manchester one. So I guess where it all started, just as lockdown was approaching and we were looking at the kind of curve and we were looking at what was happening elsewhere in the world, I wrote to UK Government and NHS England and Improvement, NHS Scotland and NHS Wales, with a couple of other industry partners, just offering any help that they might need from the, the amount of resource and expertise that we had between us. So we then got phoned on the Monday to attend Excel, which we had somebody there in a couple of hours. Really trying to understand exactly what support we could provide. And I then mobilised a team, so I mobilised that resource to go there, and then understood what exactly was needed, and I mobilised a team around about that, all with the kind of underlying principle of keep as many people working at home as possible in line with government guidelines. So we'd been working on that project for 3.5, 4 days, and it's amazing how much you learn in 4 days on projects which are moving so quickly. And really then we got similar call from NHS Wales on the Friday, and the Manchester project on the Saturday, and Glasgow on the Sunday, or I can't remember which exact order it was. And really, I kind of led the discussion to really work out what was needed, how we could help them, things to think about based on what was happening at Excel, how we could help them. And again, it was all on 2 hours notice, getting somebody down there and then trying to work out, what we could do to help. and then mobilising a team really round about that help. So within a week, we were suddenly active on 4 of these, amazing fast track projects that we've never seen at such speed before. So my role then was to set up an overarching integration team, we called it, because we really recognised that actually, although we were only 4 or 5 days into Excel, there was so much lessons coming out. And so what we did was we really tried to share information, approaches, lessons from site to site. We did this by having a central database SharePoint site so that people, if they were doing a particular deliverable, even something as simple as, or not simple, but something basic like the health and safety risk assessment, rather than do it from scratch, they were able to really look at what had been done and apply that in a bespoke way to their own project. So we set up that integration team, and we, every second night during the sort of 3 or 4 week period, each of the 4 sites dialed in, and they were able to talk about front of mind, what had happened that day, things to think about, documents to share, approaches to share, solutions to share, etc. So I really led that integration team across the time we were delivering the 4 projects.
No, that sounds incredible. And I think one of the things we talk a lot about is lessons learned. So the fact that you were doing that, in effect, that agile lessons learned all the way through that process and capturing almost like process development live, that's very different from normal projects. Can you say a bit more about how you did that process?
So, well, one of the things we recognised was obviously the NHS and the way it's structured into different trusts, etc. And then there's the devolved nations. And so one of the things we recognised, obviously our client, the 2 English ones, was the central body of NHS Improvement, part of NHS England. And so they themselves had a process set up to connect the English sites together. But because of the devolved nature of the devolved governments, obviously that doesn't link directly, naturally into Scotland and Wales. Now, we were able to not worry about any of that. We were able to think, right, we're working on 4 projects, they're all in the UK, the same things, they've all got the same challenges. We need to just share and, for the benefit of everybody, whether it was Mott MacDonald people or the end clients or the other consultants working on the projects, it didn't matter. We just wanted to really make sure that we were bringing those lessons. And, asking the 4 teams who were already working, James and Rebecca have already explained just how intense it was. And asking the 4 teams, and it was a couple of people from each team, to dial in every second night at 7 till 8 o'clock, 8:30. It was a big ask, but actually everybody wanted to do it because of the value they got from that. So there was very much, capturing processes, designs, things like that, written down, shared. People knew there was a central depository, could go in and receive things. But actually, probably the real value was the real-time information sharing. We've just encountered this problem. Have you thought about that? Oh, that's a good idea. We'll check that tomorrow morning. And so, just the value you get, and some clients who are procuring big programs of work, this becomes, this is knowledge sharing across sites, lessons learned, etc., has become more of a kind of key feature. But there's still a lot of kind of program delivery which aren't necessarily delivered in a program way, and it's just, you just lose the opportunity to gain so much by approaching things from a program perspective.
Completely agree. I think one of the things that should be quite interesting to understand is, because obviously every site is unique, and there'll be certain things like transport arrangements, access to utilities, which are probably unique between each of the sites. What did you find was the balance between the things which were unique challenges to specific hospital sites versus challenges which were just common and shared across all of the sites? What was the balance between the 2?
Well, I think, the key a lot of it was common, but obviously everything is always absolutely site specific. but the common challenges, when I get asked what were the big challenges, and I stand back and think about it, you know, program, absolutely. This was a program, you know, the pace at which these were moving was just remarkable. And to be able to deliver at that speed, you need so much working well, decision making, which James has talked about, management, communication, lines of communication. You need to think about procurement. You know, how do you procure items which are likely to be highly sought after, might have lead-in times, etc. You needed to think about how to pay contractors early so that you weren't going through the usual process. You know, they needed to spend money, and they needed to be, you know, assured that they were going to be able to, you know, be recovered for that. So program, absolutely massive challenge, and that cuts across everything. Health and safety, massive challenge. You know, health and safety risk in construction is, you know, high risk activity in any event. And here we had two bespoke kind of angles to bring into that. The fast track nature meant that you were taking an operational exhibition facility, and within days, hours, it was turning into a construction site. And then, you know, within a matter of days or weeks, it was turning into an operational facility with COVID-19 patients in it. And so we had to really think hard about those risks. And then the second one, obviously, is the COVID-19 exposure risk itself. You know, we were locked down at that point. Mott MacDonald had taken a very early decision about nobody was allowed to leave home to go to client meetings, even before the government set lockdown. And you know, we had to really think about those people who we were going to put onto the site. You know, were we able to put them on site? Did they, you know, they couldn't be going back home when they were exposed to COVID-19 risk to people who were vulnerable, or, you know, any of those, you know, sort of population groups where it would really affect them. And so we had to go through a whole process of making sure that people themselves weren't at higher risk. But then when they did leave their house, they absolutely were doing everything they could to really mitigate the COVID-19 risk, because it wouldn't really be great news if we were adding to the problem by, you know, in the process of trying to solve or find a solution to deal with the problem. So that was second challenge. Third challenge, again, just the speed at which you had to mobilise. You know, it's just fast track beyond you know, all things I've seen before. And so that mobilisation is just always going to be a challenge, particularly when we're got people, so many people working at home. But that probably, you know, worked really well, because people weren't insistent on meeting the people, etc., face to face. It's often a kind of way of ramping up in a project. You know, it was just the right person for the right job, regardless of where they were, because all of those staff working out of their living rooms or their studies or whatever. And then I guess the fourth challenge was really just how we avoided reinventing the wheel, which is why we set up that integration team. In terms of differences between the sites, everything's different. The internal, you know, the internal design is potentially, not to sort of undervalue that work at all, but the field hospital, if you want to call it that, or the clinical space, you know, BDP had the opportunity to really standardise that design across the schemes that they were involved in. The really complicated bit is what they call in sports and events sector the overlay. So it's how you convert a permanent facility for a different use into a temporary use. So stadiums do it all the time, or for Olympic Games and Commonwealth Games and Madonna concerts or whoever else. So it's really how you do that overlay and make it, you know, so that the clinical space can fit into an existing structure, but then can operate as an operational facility, interlinking with the externals, the vehicle access works, the transport for staff, all of those things work. And really the four projects we were involved in, you know, James identified at the start why the Excel was chosen. the real unique project was the Principality Stadium, because it was a stadium as opposed to a conference centre. Conference centres are large span, often they've got basements, very large external areas. Stadium was slightly more challenging in that, so in the Principality, we had some beds in the corporate hospitality suite. And then on the pitch, we had to build up the pitch to, obviously the stadium, the seating tapers back. So we had to build up on a temporary flooring to get enough space to fit the beds onto. So it was a kind of extra complication that we had to deal with.
Because I think that's one of the things which is really interesting, is the sort of lesson learned. And I know that there's some quite interesting questions coming through on chat now. And I think it'd be good to, I think there's a couple of them which really link into some of those points. I think what I'd quite like to do now is move on to kind of the Q&A side. Just one point, I know that some people put some questions into chat. If you can make sure that you put them into the Q&A as well, it means that I won't have to kind of keep flipping through between the two different panels, or make my life slightly easier, Stuart and others who are on the call. Thank you, Gerard. I see that's just pinged in, so I can see your note. So I think there is a couple of very, very quick questions, and I think I'm going to put the first one to Rebecca. So there's a question which is, within the team, because it's such a multi-team collaborative approach, was there ever a clearly identifiable project manager, or in brackets, the lead boss figure? So was there somebody who was directly accountable?
I'm going to give a really rubbish answer and say kind of, in that there was a very, very clear figure in terms of overall sign off for NHS. So anything clinical basically had to go through Andrew. But for discipline stuff, there were kind of, so Ian Watkins from Mott was very much the externals central point of contact, and so he was definitely the lead person that, anything external went through Ian. And the same thing for James, I would say, for the internals, that there were definitely leads that were then multidisciplinary for certain spaces. And we I think, probably not really reflecting on it until now, differentiated that based on operational kind of requirements rather than specifically disciplines. As kind of almost two discrete packages. We had the externals and internals, and then Ian and James were the two leads, I would say, in that sense. But then both of those streams came together critically through Andrew, and he was the ultimate sign-off for the trust.
That's great. So you had real clear accountability in terms of decision making for both at different sort of discipline levels as well as overall.
Yeah.
Perfect. So there's some other questions. So there's a few which are being upvoted. So one from Stuart MacArthur. The Nightingale success, main contractors collaborated and shared learning rapidly between projects. Supply chains were mobilised and proactive. Clinical and technical design sign-offs were rapid and mutually informed. So a good question in terms of lessons learned. Will the NHS get value for money from more traditional procurement processes for the forthcoming HIP schemes? So how can we learn from Nightingale to inform the next stage? So maybe Richard, could you maybe provide a response against that?
Yeah, absolutely. And hi, Stuart. So I think we have been having conversations with NHS moving forward about this. What the NHS achieved here with the help of its supply chains was absolutely a massive achievement. Can't underestimate it, the speed at which they moved. And what that showed is the NHS, when it needs to be, can be as reactive and as good at delivery as any other client organisation. What we find in healthcare in the UK is that hospital projects do typically take a long time to deliver for various reasons. And I think if there's one thing the NHS can learn from this is actually they can be bolder. They can look at how, I'm not suggesting we're going to start building, normal hospitals, so to speak, in a period of weeks, but actually by looking at some of the things they did to deliver these hospitals, there's great lessons to be learned about how you can cut down that long period of time it currently takes. And a lot of that, as Stuart says, is around, can we adopt more sophisticated procurement models, as we see a lot of infrastructure, alliancing models and collaboration between different supply chain partners? Can we, really the lessons learned, over a 4-week period were phenomenal. If we were able to do that across a 27 hospital HIP program, the value you'd get would be phenomenal. So yeah, I think there's a real opportunity here that this surge response has given us to think about how we take some of that, all of that if possible, and embed it into business as usual.
That's great. I think there's an additional question which I'd just like to add on to this, which was they're talking about the fact that health can move at a very slow pace. Sometimes this project needs to be driven at a quicker speed, and saying, did this cause any challenges waiting for NHS sign-off?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I thought I was reading the question, but you were saying something different there.
No, so it's basically saying that quite often these projects work at quite a slow pace, and this obviously needed to be done quickly with quick sign-off. Did that cause any problems in terms of waiting for the NHS to sign off?
No, I think the sign-off on these projects was, as well, it couldn't have been any quicker, put it that way. I think if you then compare it to how long it normally takes to do all the various sign-off for a normal project, and there's a lot of stakeholder, internal, external stakeholder engagement for good reason.
Yeah.
I'm not underplaying the importance of that, but we do really need to think about, if you're going to build 27 hospitals, rooms in different hospitals are serving the same purpose, and should we think about standardized designs so that you engage you design a room once and build it 27 times, rather than design it 27 times specific to individuals' requirements per project. So it didn't hold, no, absolutely, this wouldn't have happened if the NHS hadn't been leading the charge, making decisions in the timely manner that they did. And that's, going back to Stuart's point, that's the real opportunity here to take forward.
And certainly within, I know from sort of work that I've done previously, there's been a lot of standardisation around things like single room design, but this starts to look at how you can take some of those principles and adopt them more broadly at scale. Couple of additional questions that you just want to raise. So I think there's one that, James, I'd like just to share with you, which is there's a piece, a comment about the contribution of the UK military personnel was widely lauded. And there's a slightly loaded question here to say, was it a photo opportunity, or was there a real and significant boost for the project? So you talked quite a bit around the role of the military and also how they shape some of the processes for that rapid deployment. So could you talk really about the role of the military?
Yeah, I don't think it was interesting, because when we were doing it, it was all over the press that the Army were building this hospital, and that absolutely wasn't the case. When we got there on day one, the Army were there and they made it very clear this was an NHS project. It was not an Army-led project. The Army were there in an advisory role, but they have links. KPMG sort of project managed the scheme, and they have links with the Army, and some of the KPMG project management staff were ex-Army. So the way it was managed, I think, was from a very military perspective. Rebecca mentioned the sort of the drumbeat of the sort of twice daily meetings. I think that was very much instigated by the military. I think when we got to Nightingale on the Monday and the Tuesday, it took a while for the non-military team to work out what we were doing, how we could do this. Could these things really happen this quickly. And I think the guys from the military were looking at us thinking, what are you hanging around for? Just do it. Because they just build field hospitals. They pitch up anywhere in the world and they'll build a field hospital. And they don't really have to think about lots of things that, I think as the designers, we were concerned we'd have to worry about these things. And eventually, I mean, the Army gave us quite clear briefings. There were sort of certain mantras, time saves lives. So it was all about making the right decision quickly. And also things like simply good enough. So you can worry about making something perfect, but if it's perfect and it takes 2 weeks longer to deliver, it's not any good. So you had to make decisions quickly that were simply good enough for the purposes that were there. So from a sort of briefing and from a management perspective, the Army were absolutely involved. And then again, Rebecca talked about the blockers. There were certain instances where getting either staff or materials, the Army would be able to, you know, they produced a load of Gurkha plumbers who assisted with the gas fitting. So they didn't actually do the specialist gas fitting, but they did a lot of the fixing of the hangers for the pipework. So it was delivered by the NHS in effect, and the supply chain, the majority of the work, but the Army were absolutely involved. And I think there was an element of, at the time, I think everyone thought, let's let it go. If the British public think the Army are going to save it through building these hospitals, then that's a good thing. And I did speak to some of the guys on site who were delivering it, and I said, you know, is it bothering you? They said, no, absolutely not. They were just so happy to be involved and really sort of, and actually working in the Army was something they seemed to really enjoy doing. So.
Because I think one of the things, because obviously this is innovation and crisis series, and one of the things around innovation, which we often dismiss, is horizontal innovation. So taking ideas from one sector, applying it to another, and it feels like the role of the Army was a real kind of catalyst for working in a different way, which enabled the hospital to be built at such a pace.
It gave the team on site, I think, the confidence that they were making decisions and making good decisions for the right reasons at the time, and almost took that concern away that someone was going to come back to you in sort of 2 weeks' time and say, why did you do that, when things had changed anyway? Yes. So absolutely, it gave you a different mindset. So yes, it wasn't just a photo opportunity, they were involved positively.
Yeah, because I think for me there's some really interesting lessons around how we can take ideas, ways of working, methodologies from other sectors and applying them into healthcare and construction, because you've obviously done it at pace now, but I think there's more that we could probably learn from that.
Yeah.
Great. So one of the things which sort of heading back, Rebecca, I'd like to get your response on this, or actually just anybody, Rebecca, James or Richard. I think there's an action here for probably all of us, which is Gerard Baxter has provided a question, which is, as a supplier who's involved, how can we share lessons learned and ideas on how they should shape the future of healthcare? Will there be a team you can approach or a single point of contact? You know, and thanks for a great story of teamwork in this coverage. So I think there's an appetite for us to learn more, share more. So is there a mechanism by which suppliers can also provide their insights and help in this knowledge sharing?
I'm not sure there is, but there should be, because there was a lot of things that the supply, I mean, when shutdown was happening, builders merchants were closing down, and there were key pieces of equipment that were essential to the delivery of all these facilities. And the supply chain absolutely pulled out all the stops to deliver it. I think for Nightingale London, the medical air compressors, it's usually probably something that takes at least 6 weeks to build and deliver, and it's probably on a 12-week lead-in. This thing arrived, you know, that was almost like the critical path item that arrived on the Tuesday. So a week after we knew what we wanted, this thing arrived. So we were short of clinical wash hand basins. At one point we only had 12. You know, there was a massive, and then it was trying to find it, and then you found a supplier who could provide them, and suddenly that was freed up. So I think in terms of learning from that, I think it would be good. I don't know how it's done, but it would be good to get some feedback from the supply chain as to how we deliver that and whether that can feed into the future hospitals. It would seem to make sense.
So does it feel like there's... Oh, sorry, go for it.
Sorry, I was thinking I need a hands up function. The only thing I would in some ways caveat on this though is that we were we were in an emergency type situation. It was very much a crisis. And so, you know, normal rules went completely out the window, you know, and if I called up, say, in a normal project situation and was as demanding as we were in that situation, that probably wouldn't have been reciprocated or responded to quite in the same way, if that makes sense. And that, you know, people were quite like, I'm just thinking the amount of actually voluntary stuff and time that we got given from the supply chain was staggering, because people genuinely wanted to help. And, you know, that was why we were all on site as well, because we wanted to be a part of this. And that was, you know, we were trying to do something better for society. And so I guess that's the kind of caveat, is that actually, you know, we can't rely in some ways on people's generosity. And actually there was quite a lot of both personal time in terms of resource, but also physical resources that were donated to this project in lots of ways that you just wouldn't otherwise get without the same circumstances. So that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think that's a bit of a reality check in some ways, that this was a completely unparalleled situation. That is quite hard to, I guess, replicate.
So Rebecca, I think one of the things we're talking about here is the fact that we need to capture lessons learned. So the lessons learned, which are both the positive ones, but the things which are unique to this type of situation that we should learn from, we can still learn from, but in a different way. So is there something about making sure that we do continue to capture this lessons learned, so that we can embed these into new programs going forward?
Yeah, so I think a really good example of that was about reducing. We got quite a lot of, so for example, we got quite a lot of furniture donated from WeWork, because they had decanted a lot of WeWork spaces, and they said, you know, we've got all this office furniture or other, you know, it wasn't just desks and chairs, it was other equipment that got donated to us, that meant that we, you know, both we had it, you know, very rapidly, but also it then was very low cost, and obviously massively reduced waste, and there was all sorts of carbon, you know, reductions from that as well. So, and the fact that we reused the building actually is another massive, that enabled this accelerated program, because we were reusing an existing asset. So I think there's a lot of, there were lots of really good things there, that because we used equipment or materials, etc., that were existing, but just relocated them from somewhere else within society or within the city, that enabled the very rapid solutions to be found, I would say, which is definitely something we need to look for as a more sustainable answer, shall we say.
So I think there's a piece which it feels like there's a need to make sure that we fully capture lessons learned, both from the team who are leading the project, but also the suppliers who are involved, and get their perspectives too, to make sure that we've got that full 360 view of feedback, I suppose. Just sort of moving on, because I'm aware that we're sort of coming up to closing out in the next sort of 5-6 minutes. Richard, there's a really, I really like this question from Keith Sellers, and I'd love to get your view on this, which is, what were the 3 most important areas you would change with hindsight if you were to do it again?
Oh.
It's such a mean question. I absolutely love it.
The 3 most important areas.
You can even say one.
Well, there's it's maybe not answering the question, but I think what we need to do so that we can deal with this better in the future is have thought about surge capacity as part of the built environment, as a built-in component of healthcare system design, whether that is within hospitals or whether that is, you know, when you're at a city planning scale, thinking about adjacent buildings, for example, student accommodation or universities, you know, think about when you design them, if they're next to a hospital, how they might be converted. The other thing I would question is, so alongside our input to this, and it was probably more thinking about the international markets we are involved in, But alongside this, we developed a modular solution, which took a number of weeks to develop. And then, once it's developed, it can be rolled out in a number of weeks. Now, obviously, time didn't allow that development stage here for the NHS, and they absolutely had to go to the repurposing of existing facilities. But to me, if we'd been in a state of readiness for an event like this and had some of those modular accommodation types in principle designed, ready for rollout, the modular facility does allow you to be a lot more flexible about where you put it. You can put it next to hospitals, so you can get the sort of joined up services across the hospital and the surge facility. And modular also allows you to have a legacy issue, so you can effectively embed them as part of your estate going forward. Now, couldn't have been done here because, when we think back to when this was started, what was happening in Europe and everywhere else, and what the curve was looking like in the UK and the level of kind of adherence to lockdown at that point, there was not the time to do that. So this could not have been done here in this timescale. But, thinking forward, should we have those solutions on the shelf, and be in a state of readiness, and that applies to all healthcare systems around the world, really.
Yeah. So I think what you're sort of saying is that there's lessons learned we can take both directly from the Nightingale Hospitals, but wider lessons learned into how we approach healthcare design more generally as well. And I think that reflects some of the conversations around HIP as well. I'm just aware of time because we've got kind of 2 minutes before I think we get closed out. So I just wanted to put a couple of closing remarks in. And if there was some really, really pithy comments from each of you. So because one of the pieces around this is around what the learnings we're planning on taking forward and applying to every day. So one of the things I'd love to get your views on is just what's the one thing that you're taking forward from this into the work that you do now. So James, pithy 20-second response. What is the one thing you've learned?
Anything is possible. If you've got a client that says they want to do something, then absolutely they can do it. There's no way, if I'd have been asked about this 6 months ago, that you'd have thought we could put something together like this in less than 10 days. So it just shows with everyone, with the right brief, the right client, the right decision makers, and a really good team that understand and all want to pull in the same direction, you can deliver almost anything.
Amazing. Rebecca, what's your one thing?
I think the working practice is something that I'm definitely trying to embed and trying to be more tech, if that makes sense. So with these kind of stand-ups and this conversation of you don't need to tell everyone the fact you've done your job well, you just tell them if you've got a problem and that you're going to impact something else, is a narrative that's really efficient and actually hopefully will make us more productive within the construction sector.
Richard, what's your 20-second summary?
I think that the NHS and other healthcare providers have a huge opportunity to take the learning on, moving forward for how we can engage supply chains, encourage collaboration, or deliver, much more collaborative models, more sophisticated procurement models and contracting models to really ultimately deliver quicker, better, and for the benefit of delivering better healthcare outcomes, really.
Fantastic. So just to kind of close out, I just want to say an enormous thank you to James, Rebecca and Richard. I found it an incredibly inspiring and interesting session to find out how do you actually take an idea to a hospital in around 16-20 days. From specification, contract, design, build, handover. It's not something that I've ever seen before, certainly in the UK, and it's lovely to see how so many disciplines came together so quickly, but also were willing to take ideas from other people. So quite often one of the challenges we talk about is collaboration, and I think this is a really busting a lot of myths that collaboration is difficult. It is just the fact that you need the right processes that enable collaboration to work well. And it's a skill that we do have in the sector, because otherwise without effective collaboration, this couldn't have happened. But sometimes I think we get in our own way in terms of actually being able to collaborate at pace. I think for me, there's another piece which I think we haven't touched on much here, but I think would be really something useful to think about from the sector side, is around, we were talking about the COVID-19 exposure risk during lockdown and how that changed how we worked in terms of the building of the Nightingale Hospitals. Well, that exposure risk hasn't gone away. So how can we take some of those processes and mechanisms to reduce risk of exposure on site into other sites, which might be in healthcare situations or in construction more generally? And I think for me, the other piece was really about exploring how the team borrowed existing ideas, used existing technology, and applied them new ways. Because for me, innovation is about the application of ideas to deliver outcomes. And for me, every single part of this process was innovative in terms of the way that it was dealt with at such a pace and at each stage to basically learn and deliver outcomes at scale. So I think for me, there's just a huge number of lessons we can take from this. A huge thank you to, again, to James, Rebecca and Richard, and thank you all for actually turning up, listening and asking some very good questions.